Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Nasar, and I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the organisers to Identities, Global Studies in Culture and Power, RaceEd, KC at Lancaster University, to this event. As our title indicates, our meeting today foregrounds the public secret that racialization is a cornerstone of current and unfolding developments in France. Now, as I speak to you from France's near neighbour with its own colonial and post-colonial history of state racialization and resistance to it, though of course, as we say in Scotland, it was all the fault of the English. It's clear that the dominant ways of analysing and arguing and acting without recognising racism that are prevailing will matter for all racial justice movements. And so we are joined this afternoon by speakers who can help us to attend to this. Firstly, by locating the protests sparked by the police killing of 17-year-old Nadia in a wider pattern of police violence in France. Secondly, to help us try to connect a number of societal spheres that entrench and reproduce systemic racial injustice. And thirdly, to help make plain how the Republic as a normative grammar of political discourse is mere ideology if it becomes willful to name racism, or as if to talk about the divisions, to quote Sarah Ahmad, is to bring it into existence in the first place. And our speakers today are exceptionally well placed to guide, to educate, to challenge in this regard, and we're fortunate to have them with us. Our first speaker will be Mame-Fatou Niang, who is an associate professor of French and Francophone studies and founder and director of the Centre for Black European Studies at the Atlantic at Carnegie Mellon University. She'll be followed by Jean Beaman, who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and her ethnographic work has focused on state violence in France and the United States. She'll be followed by Ibrahim Bechrouri, who is a scholar, a writer, and activist, and whose academic interests centre around terrorism and counterterrorism. And he currently teaches at City University in New York. And last but by no means least, we'll be joined by Nina Kiwan, who's a professor of French and Francophone studies in the School of Language, Literature, Music and Visual Culture at the University of Aberdeen. So our speakers will speak for 10 minutes each, and after this we will open up the chat for comment and questions. Please note that we're recording this session, and so bear that in mind for the contributions you'll make. And I would be grateful if you'd keep your mics muted and hold oral questions until the Q&A. And without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker. Ma'am, it's over to you whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for, it's always a pleasure to reconnect with colleagues, esteemed colleague Jean, Ibrahim, On se doit un café à Paris, and then all the people who took time to come think with us about how to, what's happening right now on the ground in France and how we got here and how we can get out of here. I'm right now in Paris, freshly coming from Lyon, where we've been trying for the past 10 days to get kids out of jail. These are kids with or without police records being handed sentences that we've never seen. I mean, this is really, many of my lawyer colleagues are talking about, unprecedented, kids without police records getting 6 months, 8 months, 12 months in jail for glasses, a can of beer or a can of Coke. So how did we get here? So as you know all, on June 27, Tuesday, June 27 of this year, 17-year-old Nadia Merzouki was driving a rented Mercedes with two friends in Nanterre, the suburbs of Paris. And Nadia is French, a French kid of Algerian origin. His mother had given him 20 euros to get breakfast at McDonald's. And 30 minutes after handing him the money, she received news that her son had died. Nadia was killed by a police officer who initially claimed that he had seen a Mercedes with a revving engine driving in the bus lane, and that upon confronting the driver tried to run him over. That was what was first said, and it was immediately said in French news that the kid was known, had a police record for being a delinquent with a heavy record. That was not true, and it also said that so that was the first thing that came. And but someone who saw that notice, that official notice that came out from the Ministère de l'Intérieur, had a video of the arrest. And we saw the video showing the arrest, showing one cop yelling, "Don't move or I'll put a bullet in your head," while a second officer shouts, "Shoot him." And that version that we seen on the video was corroborated by one of the occupants of the car, another teenager. Two teenagers were in the car with Nael, who added that Nael was hit repeatedly with pistol butts by both officers, by one of the officers, and that he let go of the brake after having been pistol whipped in the head. Because the car was automatic, that made it restart, and one officer shot Nael at point blank range in the heart. That started this sequence of revolts, several days and nights in multiple cities in France. And just yesterday, the MEDEF said that the amounts of things destroyed, of goods destroyed, amounted to somewhere north of 1 billion euros, with more than 200 shops destroyed, 200 banks, schools, libraries. So I just wanted to share one image with you to understand how we got there, because the first reaction that Emmanuel Macron had, especially after the video came out, was that this was inexcusable, but he didn't understand how we got there. As if we had not been writing, talking, speaking. I'm talking about scholars, I'm talking activists in the ground, writing that how Nael's death, how Nael's murder was one line in a story that has been written since France decided at the end of the 15th century to go visit, colonize the world and get colonies. And you'll see how I come to this conclusion. I'm just sharing with you one image. Okay, so do you see the image that I'm sharing?
We do, yeah.
Okay, so you will, I took it at the place where Nael died, and I think I was immediately struck by the fact that his life stopped at a place named Nelson Mandela, and that he died on what used to be one of the biggest slums in Europe, Le Bidonville de Nanterre, the slums of Nanterre. And that is absolutely tied to the history of migration and the settlements of Black and Brown people in France in the 20th century. In the 20th century, because our presence in this country predates that. Personally, my family has been on the mainland since 1835. I'm a 7th generation French. And that really strikes people in America when I say it, because in America, my kids were born in America. They are 1st generation American. In France, I'm a 7th generation French. Immigration, foreignness is something that you inherited apparently in France. But what I found more interesting is that he died in a place called Nelson Mandela. And to me, that really struck me as this thing that we have in France of, de-racializing our history with racism, with oppression of Blacks, Browns, Muslim, by making it a foreign affair. I went to a school that was called Rosa Parks, right? This park near my house is called Martin Luther King. Anti-Blackness is an American thing. Anti-Blackness is something, that Brazil did. Anti-Blackness is apartheid. It's not us. The Republic is recognizing these figures, right, of civil rights, while at the same time not recognizing what's happening in France. So I thought it was very ironic and tragic that his life stopped at this place called Nelson Mandela. And the fact that also he died at the very place, Nanterre, that used to be a slums, and the history of these places where we all know the story of colonized subjects being taken from Northern Africa, from Sub-Saharan Africa, to help not just for the war efforts, right, in the troops, but also repair France after the horrible destruction of the Second World War. So we have this story of people being taken from Algeria, Tunisia, Dakar, the Caribbean, to come repair France, but on short stay. They had short contracts. And what happened is that in the 1950s, the government realized that some of them were staying because we didn't want them to stay. Nothing was made to accommodate their stays. And many of them ended up in these slums that you will find around Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux, etc. That led to a huge scandal, especially following some of the harshest winters that we had in the 20th century, in the 1950s, with the pressure, housing pressure, of the states creating what we call the Cité de Transit, transition projects. And that finally gave birth to the HLM, the projects. And these projects with high concentration of Black and Brown citizens. I wrote my dissertation, I have a background in urban planning, architecture, and I wrote my dissertation on one of those, Grigny, and explaining how some of these places were created to last 5, 10 years, and 60, 70 years later, they are still standing. And I'm just letting you imagine the type of structural issues that that you can find in such place. So the place of his death is highly symbolic of our, the way we deal with race, the way we deal with the colonial history, the way we, try to push this literally at the periphery of our cities. So a difference, I have 3 minutes, a difference with, why were people so mad in 2023? A big difference with 2005. I spent the last week, I think I had a full night of sleep maybe 4 days ago, spending the first 8 days of the riots with the baby cousins, trying, especially girls, trying to keep the boys home, because there was something of the virality of snapshots that just took the kids outside. And to us, when I speak of virality, it's really one of the biggest difference that we noticed in 2005. And talking about also virality and images, people really being, inflamed by the fact that this mise à mort, this murder was caught on tape, and still people are not recognizing, right, everything and the trauma of having 14-year-old, 15-year-old being stopped by police. I mean, the initial cause of his death is the fact that he's stopped by police. And, the conversation online is people saying, I mean, the police doesn't stop you without reason. If you stop, there's a reason. Not understanding the daily lives of kids in this banlieue, brown, Black kids, Muslim kids, who by the age of 12 have absolutely lost account of the number of times they've been stopped to ask for their identity. What I call la douane républicaine, right? This way of literally putting on a border, a symbolic border of you having to be checked to prove your citizenship at 12. And to me, one of the things that I'm really working on is not just the frequency of this. I mean, sometimes, and this was the case with Adama, on the day of his death, he was checked twice by the same policeman. And sometimes these people had been on the block for years and they know the kids, but they will stop them multiple times. And not just the frequency, but the manner, right? The violence, the humiliation. And I think all of that just exploded in a mix of sadness and anger that I absolutely personally witnessed in my cousins, like literally these 6'10" big Black guys, 17, 18-year-old crying, sobbing on me like babies. And this mix of just, what are we doing? So that, and the response of the government in 2005, 2 minutes, the rebels of 2005 gave birth to this, okay, let's get more diversity, get more people in jobs and government, we can make this work. And what we're seeing now is completely different. The response is repressive, right? It started with this absolutely insane police note that came from 2 of the biggest syndicate of police, saying that if the government is not giving them what they want in order to reestablish order, they will take their own responsibility. I mean, this was absolutely, in any republic, in any democracy, this is an act of sedition. And it looks like the state is caving in, because what we're seeing now is a debate on immigration. And again, going back to my first point, many of these kids are not immigrants. Their families have been in France for 20, 30, 40, 100, 200 years. Why is the debate on immigration and not on police violence? Why is the debate on the absence of race and racism in the police? And really, where do we get from here? 1 minute, and I'm really finished. The most pressing issue for us, if you are abroad, try to see, I can share links. We need money for legal funds. It's really the most pressing issue. When you have a 17-year-old, 18-year-old who's been admitted at a university and who's sitting in jail for 6 months for the first time of her life, we don't have time to theorize or write articles. We need money to find a good lawyer to get her out. And then once that first moment of urgency, legal help is out, where do we go from there? I don't know. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Jean, over to you.
Thank you. Let me just pull up my notes here. Okay, thank you so much, Nasar and Race Ed and Identities and everyone for being here. I'm really honored to be on this panel with esteemed colleagues and friends whose work I've used and been in conversation with for many years. So I'm going to kind of piggyback on a lot of what was already said, and I thank you, Mom, for the sort of really powerful foundation that you laid. I was trying to think about where I can intervene in this conversation, particularly in light of the brilliance of my co-panelists, but also because this is such a complex topic. And so I'm going to hopefully speak in 10 minutes, very quickly, on 3 kind of interrelated themes. And most of this stems from just my 15-year plus work in doing field work in some communities, including Nanterre, around issues related to race, racism, and global migration. And I'll get to that hopefully in a second. So first, I really am struck by, and I want to kind of introduce into the conversation, the notion of a kind of selective remembering or misremembering, and the quote unquote surprise when events like this occur. And by events, I mean both the sort of killing of Niang, but also the sort of subsequent protests and uprisings. One is because I think this is a part of a long pattern of active denial and misremembering of racism in France and ongoing colonialism in France. So not just France's colonial history, but the ongoing legacies and practices of colonialism. And hopefully I'll be able to get back to that. And so what I want to do is think about this, not just in terms of, and so what I think the work that this does is often allows us to think about this in terms of sort of individual or isolated events, rather than something that's part of a broad ongoing pattern. And more importantly, equally importantly, something that's systematic. So, racism is systematic, police violence is systematic, but we're actively encouraged to see these events as isolated individual moments. And I want to suggest that that's not an accident that we're being encouraged to think that way. And in particular, I was thinking a lot about sort of the broader notion of what history gets remembered and what history is actively suppressed, particularly in sort of construction of national narratives in this sort of seemingly quote unquote post-colonial era. So I'm thinking about Michel Rothro's work and Stoller's work on colonial aphasia as a sort of alternative to thinking about using the terms like a forgotten history or a colonial amnesia, rather to really be intentional about the fact that this is a history that is actively suppressed and is continually actively suppressed. And this allows us to continue to be sort of surprised, in quotation marks, when events like this happen. And then the other thing I wanted to say to that point is this also made me think a lot about late philosopher Charles Mill's notion of epistemology of ignorance, right? Again, so the idea that the history of French colonialism is very well established, the ongoing practices are very well established, but we're actively encouraged to pretend as if we don't know what those patterns and practices are. And that fuels into a lot of, frankly, what I've seen in the last week or so in terms of media coverage of some of these events. And I'll come back to that in a second. The next related point I want to make is around the notion of distancing, which I think also gets to questions of selective remembering and misremembering. And so by that, I mean how much we're encouraged to see racism, and Mem alluded to this as well, racism as existing elsewhere, but not in France or not even in Europe, right? So, the idea that anti-racist protests in France are some kind of parodying of what's happening in the United States versus something that's part of a very long history of anti-racist struggle and struggle for Black liberation within France itself. And we're actively encouraged to understand or sort of make sense of these events as something that's being, influenced by elsewhere versus something that's, homegrown, for lack of a sophisticated way of saying that. And that also reminds me a lot of David Theo Goldberg's framework of racial Europeanization, of thinking about how racism is often a problem everywhere but in Europe, where instead it is exceptional. So again, we're encouraged to think about these uprisings as unique, isolated events and not connected to anything broadly systemic or structural in French society. The second kind of related point I wanted to make is related to the question of narrative, which goes back to kind of what I was just saying about distancing and the ways in which, again, how a particular kind of narrative is continually enforced and reinforced both within and outside of France. And I think that shapes a lot of the sort of media coverage that we've seen, primarily internationally, because frankly, I haven't seen that much within France, and maybe we could talk about that. But anyway, but sort of this sort of, again, like seeing these incidents as sort of isolated, having the sort of narrative of the police taken as fact versus being questioned. And then when there's video footage, then it turns into a narrative of blaming the victim, or the victim being a criminal or being criminally prone. And then you have the other unsurprising narrative of people protesting being blamed themselves, curfews being established, and then the sort of narrative of the police as victims, which I think, among other things, you've seen in the GoFundMe account for the police officer involved, right? And so this is like, these are again, like very common sort of patterns of narrative, but again, we're always encouraged to see these as sort of separate incidents or surprises than actually, again, is something that's partly systemic. Next point I want to make is around what I think also touched on very nicely, is around this sort of general, the general sort of understanding we have or are meant to have around who is even French, who's even included in French society, and the ongoing ways that the police, among other agents of the state, are engaged in this sort of boundary work in terms of determining who is seen as French and who is, as I've argued in my own work, seen as suspect, as a suspect citizen, as a sort of like incapable of ever being included into the polity. So this, I think, when you see someone like Niang as a suspect and not as a citizen, not as a French person, that, among other things, leads to a justification of his death, of violence against him, against people like him. And so, as Mem was saying that she's a 7th generation French person, I think we also have to be attentive to the ways that, the notion of foreigner and foreignness are also social constructions, right? Where France is, particularly in what France is also a construction, particularly if we think about France's colonial empire, right? What are the actual borders of France? And so, again, we have a very intentionally narrow definition of what that means, that leads to a lot of the violence that we're seeing today. And then I think the last point I'll say, also kind of related to my research and related to some of the sort of interwoven with some of the other points I've made, is the necessity to see this as part of another moment in a long colonial arc. And so what we're seeing now is not a sort of rupture in relations between Black and brown people and the police, but rather part of an ongoing colonial relationship that dates to when many, when France had colonies in much of North and West Africa and other parts of the globe. And so if we think about it that way, if we take a sort of colonial lens, then it almost it almost seems natural, for lack of a better word, that the police would be engaged in the same violence today that they were engaged in 100 years ago, because the police were doing this boundary work within the colonies themselves, and they're only continuing it in the present hexagon in present day France. So I try to think about this both in terms of how we're actively being encouraged to not acknowledge France's political history, like method of intentional suppressing, and the sort of more sort of social work that active suppression does. And I think I'll stop there. I think I'm close to time. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jean. Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nasar. Thank you for everyone who is here to think about this really important issue with us. It's hard to go after, of course, Jean and Mom, but I'll do my best. I think there was 3 things that I wanted to talk about. I don't know how far I'll go, but basically I want to talk about the infamous 2017 law that some people are portraying as the cause of Niall's death. I want to talk also about the genealogy of police killings in France and policing in France, linked to counterinsurgency tactics. And I wanted to talk, if I have time, about Islam and Muslims in all of that. So let's start with the 2017 law. So in 2017, the law was changed basically to allow police officers to shot people who refuse to comply with orders. And that law was at the time called out by many scholars and activists. And since then, the police killings have gone up. I'm quoting Siama's Bag here, who's one of the authorities when it comes to like, police violence and police killings in France, if not the authority. And she explains that before that law, we had about like, 15 police killings a year, which is already too much. But since then, like, numbers have gone up sharply. And she talks about at least 30 killings in 2019, 46 in 2020, 53 in 2021. So it's going up. And so in 2022, 39. But it might be like, reevaluated to be like, the number might like actually grow. And so far it has been about 1 killing a week in 2023. So this law is important, but it's also important to understand the concrete decisions that this new law created, both from like, policemen and from the judicial system. I'm going to tell you the story of Nordin, who was shot 7 times by the police in Stein, really close to where I live when I'm in France, in the northern banlieue of Paris, and who survived. His wife, Mariel, also got shot, and she was pregnant and she lost her child. And the circumstances of the shooting by like this police shooting, this police tentative of assassination really, are really interesting. We have a video like for Nadia. A lot of people said like, the reason why like things blowed up with Nadia were the video doesn't always like, work this way. We have a video in which we see a car coming toward Nordin's car. Nordin is driving, going home from the restaurant. The car is coming toward Nordin's car, and policemen are already jumping out of the car, except you can't identify them as policemen. They're wearing like, plainclothes, they're plainclothes officer. Nordin, seeing that, is thinking he's gonna get mugged basically, and try to run away from what he thinks is an attack on him and his wife, Mariel. And the police immediately, without showing any sign that they're the police, decide to shoot. They shot him, as I said, 7 times. He survived. And we have a video showing all of that. I would have done the same thing. Like the video, if I was put in that situation, I would have done the same thing. I would have tried to escape from that situation. The interesting thing is that in 2022, there was a judgment on this specific case. But the judgment was not a judgment of the police officers. It was a judgment of Nordin. Nordin was condemned during this judgment to 2 years in prison. He has to spend now, like, he's going to appeal it. He's going to spend like, 2 years in prison if that judgment is confirmed by the First Circuit Court, because he didn't comply with the police. So not only the police can shoot people, but also if you don't comply with the police, you end up being shot. You might be the one who end up in prison. The 2 police officers who are accused of shooting him are only now considered by the justice, meaning like they're not like, there's no trial that took place already. They're just like, considered as like potential, like, suspect when it comes to the shooting of Nordin, his wife and their baby to born. So that's like, really interesting to see that. That's also interesting to see that the discourse against around police killings changed a lot. The discourse around like, the police and support for the police didn't change a lot, I'm sorry, but kind of like, kept being really supportive from the left to the right of the political spectrum. Of course, there are like some forces on the left who call out police killings, but when it comes to the head of the Green Party in 2021, the head of the Communist Party, and the head, of course, of like, Macron's party, Renaissance now, but it was La République En Marche, all of them, like, keep on supporting the police. So the 2017 law, as it's in itself was a problem, it created more killings. It also created like, the possibility for discourse and judicial decisions to be made on this case that are really revolting. But it's not enough to go back to 2017, as Mame and Jean mentioned. The practices that the policies that the police is using in France have a long history, and the colonial genealogy of this policy has been unraveled by many researchers. And among them, there is Mathieu Rigouste, whose works are unfortunately not translated, I think, in English. L'ennemi intérieur et l'institution policière, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm mistaken about the books, like please, like, you know, the titles of the books, please let me know. And Mathieu Rigouste basically explained that counterinsurgency tactics that were used in Algeria and over colonial context before the independence were officially given up at the independence of Algeria after the Algerian Liberation War. But that these tactics, this way of thinking that he calls l'esprit de défense, the spirit of defense, has been, like, you know, preserved within the media and also within some French institutions, police schools, the military school, etc., etc. And these counterinsurgency tactics, and I'm gonna share my screen real quick, are literally tactics of terror. This is why Paul Osares and Roger Trinquet, who were both involved in the Algerian War. Paul Osares was in charge of the torture of many, like, you know, Algerian so-called rebels, liberation fighters. Say that counter-terror, in the context of counterinsurgency, counter-terror, not counter-terrorism, was instituted, but unofficially, of course. Roger Trinquet, in La Guerre Moderne, said that the essential means to prevail in modern warfare, meaning counterinsurgency warfare, to secure the unconditional support of the population. That support will be obtained by an appropriate organization, but will maintain it by all means, the most effective being terrorism. So what they're saying is that the way counterinsurgency tactics that become the way in which policing, especially policing of post-colonial bodies in France, is conducted, are strategies of terror. And when, I think it was Mame that talked about that, when people get their identity checked, not once, not twice, but sometimes even, like, you know, 3 or 4 times in a week by the same police officer who recognize you but smiles, the objective is not to check your identity. The objective is to terrorize you. The objective is to make sure that you comply and that you understand that within the Republic, you're only, if you're a citizen, you're only a second, you know, grade citizen. So it's interesting, I think, and I'll end on that. It's interesting to link these counterinsurgency tactics to the recent rise of a specific narrative in France, the narrative of separatism. I don't know how many of you have heard of the narrative of separatism, but it became, it's also a law, the law against separatism, but it's the idea that in France there is an Islamist separatist, like, you know, movement whose goal is to take over, like, you know, the Republic and put in its place a totalitarian Islamic regime. So that's the idea between the idea of, like, you know, separatism. What we've seen after the uprising in the banlieue, the uprisings in France, is that intellectuals and political leaders have talked about a new form of separatism, a separatism of the banlieue, a separatism of that youth that live in the banlieue, that is mostly black and brown, and that is trying to separate itself from the Republic. Separatism is a really strong word. Like, you know, it's not exactly the word insurgent, but it's really close to the word, like, you know, insurgent. Like an insurgency can be separatist, for example. And I think that the idea here is to create the potentiality for this political party and for the intellectuals that, like, support them, the potentiality for civil war, the potentiality for civil war, or at least, like, you know, the thought that civil war could occur, that will allow for the even more dire policing and control and suppression in the worst cases of post-colonial bodies. I will stop here. I hope it was kind of clear.
Thank you. Thank you. Both very clear. Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Nadia, over to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Nasar, and also just thank you for the invitation. I'm honoured also to be able to talk about these really important issues with all of you today. So thanks to Identities and Race Ed as well for the invitation. So I think it may be useful if we try to anchor our reflections on the urban uprisings in France following the murder of Naël Merzouk in Nanterre on the 27th of June to sort of 4 analytical lenses, and those are the following. One is social segregation. The second one is the denial or disavowal of race and racism. The third is language, and finally, I'm going to talk a bit about authoritarianism and the militarization of French society. So clearly, kind of, you know, building on what's been said already by my colleagues. So the first sort of lens, if you like, thinking about social segregation and how that can help us to sort of kind of begin to understand what's been going on in France. So people will know, I'm sure, that, you know, post World War II, there's a huge wave of migrant labour, which is brought in mainly from North Africa to rebuild France during the sort of 30 Glorieuses, or 30 years of post-war expansion. It was very much regarded as a temporary, unskilled and male and workforce. Who would come and sort of help build France after the World War II and then would return home. And of course, this didn't happen. We have in 1974, the family reunion policy is introduced, which means that for the first time, wives were able to join migrant laborers, and you know, they settled and children were born. And of course, then we have the emergence of the second generation. I know Mum's talked about the seventh generation, but I'm just talking specifically about this type of sort of labor migration in the post-World War II period, because of course, they're in relation to housing and social segregation. The first ways of migrant sort of housing was extremely basic. As Mame already alluded to, Nanterre, where Naël was murdered, was the site of one of the largest bidonvilles or shanty towns in France, housing up to 10,000 migrants, most of them Algerian. And so Nanterre, the bidonville, or the shanty town of Nanterre, became sort of this very powerful sort of symbol, if you like, of kind of the urban banishment of migrants. So with the sort of policy of regroupement familial or family reunion from the mid-1970s onwards, there is this sort of general move towards building social housing, still on the outskirts of cities and large towns. So, for example, the Nanterre bidonville or shanty town was completely destroyed in 1970. And I think that what's the particularity of these spaces is, and this has been written about by urban, people, scholars of urban planning, is often there is kind of, in some way, the antithesis of traditional French sociality. So these high-rise tower blocks, very, very little social infrastructure. Transport is a major issue. So, for example, if you think about this is sort of the banlieue around Paris, it's where I've done works in my book on identities, discourse, and experience, looked at the sort of 93 and the sort of Aubervilliers-Courneuve area, very, very close geographically to Paris, to, you know, the sort of Petite Couronne, if you like, but a kind of a whole world away because the transport infrastructure is not there. And so that's also kind of created this sense of a real strong segregation. Here I'm talking about Paris, but we can talk about this in relation to other cities. And so the work of, you know, my colleague Abdelali Hajat, who's done work on that in relation to Lyon and Vénissieux, for example, gives some really powerful insights into this segregation, which is not just something which kind of just happened, but there's a sort of structural issue here, talking about sort of institutional racism. So, you know, social housing being allocated in discriminatory fashion being one element, so-called white flight being another element. And I was thinking about Fanon here and his work on de la violence. You know, he talks about une société coloniale. So he says that, you know, colonial society is a compartmentalized society. So I think Jean alluded to this idea of a kind of almost like a colonial present. I think when one just goes around France's large cities, Paris is the one I'm most familiar with. I'm sitting in Nantes at the moment. We can talk about that in colonial past, maybe in the discussion, but there is a very strong sense of segregation where migrant and post-migrant communities are more often than not parked on the outskirts of this cultural centers of economic and political power. So when you look at this in a sort of longitudinal sense, and there's been a lot of work done on this, which shows that the statistics on, say, on educational outcomes, the unemployment rates, for example, are much, much higher amongst French people, and they are French, they've been born in France, educated in France, will be much, much higher than for the so-called non-immigrant origin population. So this kind of takes me to my second point, in that, the French state, to a certain extent, has tried to address some of these issues, but it's always via this socioeconomic lens. So there's, this language of euphemism is used. So, for example, the educational policy, which we've seen in the banlieue, being the zone d'éducation prioritaire, these sort of education priority zones, which have, were created some time ago, whether that's through urban planning, but it's always talking about sort of neighborhoods and sort of socioeconomic indicators. So there's a complete disavowal of questions around sort of racialize the difference in institutional policy kind of language. I mean, and you'll know, many of you, I'm sure, that just even, the term race is very difficult to talk about in the French context. It was removed also from the constitution because of this myth, this myth of universalism, Republican universalism, which means that public policy is designed to be difference blind or color blind, if you like. So that kind of takes me into the second point about this kind of disavowal or denial of racism and state racism. And, as my colleagues today have alluded to, there's a complete avoidance of thinking about the post-colonial legacies in France. And, the fact that the Algerian War of Independence wasn't even called a war until 1999, these are all indicators of difficulties for talking about the sort of continuities between colonial France and post-colonial France in terms of its governance of migrant populations. So this sort of blind spot, I'd say, around race, around difference, is fundamentally linked to a historical blind spot or amnesia, I think Jean called it, about France's colonial past, and the way in which the French state to post-migrant youth inequality, structural inclusion is sort of atrophied or sort of truncated at source, because it's always couched in these universalist euphemizing terms, les jeunes de quartier, young people from the neighborhood, just young people, at most young people of immigrant heritage or issus de l'immigration. So yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about institutional or state racism. I won't go into, I'm looking at the time, I won't go into too much detail, but there's almost like a literal policing of language, as well as the policing of the populations, in how to even talk about some of these issues, structural racism and institutional racism. I'm just going to move on to, so this is the question of language, I think, is really key. So, in terms of trying to, how can we apprehend what's been going on in France? So I think one has to mention the media clearly, because it also uses and reinforces this language of euphemism circling around the issues. But of course, on the other side, it's a spectrum reinforcing stigma, talking about riots, talking about sort of lawlessness, insecurity, as if, the acts of people who are enraged by the racist murder of their, one of their peers, as if it was just, it has no political meaning, it's just completely sort of chaotic and mindless, let's say. So that is the language of the media. There's also the language of the state and of Macron. And I was struck by something here in the press conference he gave on the 30th of June. Macron talked about parental responsibility and not tolerating any more unrest from young people. And it had a sort of very kind of, I would say, quite a civilizing mission tones. That this is a trope which one hears over and over again. I think in a transhistorical sense, where there's an allusion to this racist perception that migrant families don't know how to keep their children in check, particularly their young men. And what's particularly interesting here is the claim that Macron makes. After that, he immediately said, it's not up to the Republic to play the role of the mother and fathers. you know, it's up to the families, which completely contradicts the usual claims about how the Republic and its institutions are there to emancipate the children of immigrants, particularly when it comes to Muslim girls, and in prohibiting the wearing of the headscarf in the school. So that just leads me on to my last point, and I'll finish just a 1 minute on authoritarianism and the militarization of political life. So Ibrahim's quite right. He talks about the 2017 law on firearms, allowing police to, you know, to carry firearms. I think there's also, you know, since the terrorist attacks of, you know, 2015 onwards, this creation of the state of exception, the use of curfews going back to 2005, and then again curfews here in 2023, again being used in, those were that's legislation which was used in colonial Algeria. This is not anodyne. All of this kind of has contributed, the loi sécurité globale as well, and many civil restrictions involved in that, which shore up the power of the police. This contribute to this sort of militarization of society. And what's interesting, and you know, my colleague Jim Wolfries, who I've written with about these issues, and Ibrahim as well, have talked about this. You know, when Macron was elected in 2017, he was kind of hailed by the European press, certainly the sort of UK press, as being this sort of, you know, bulwark against the Rassemblement National, against racist populism. However, what we've seen, I think, is this very clear development of a neoliberal authoritarianism, so passing laws, whether it's on the reforms of the pensions via ordonnance, by decree, not through debate, whether it's the separatism law, which Ibrahim alludes to, which speaks to the importance of Islamophobia as part of this this hostile context, which continually creates suspicion that Mame was talking about, this idea of people just being monitored and bounded and boundaried, where, you know, where we have, so that sort of legal, authoritarian, political context kind of contributes to these rather well, very problematic stereotypes around young men of North African origin, such as Nael, as being, you know, either petty criminals or potential jihadists. And so, you know, that very hostile environment kind of empowers these institutions and individuals. So I'm going to stop there now. I think I've spoken for long enough, but thank you.
Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for taking time to speak to us, many of whom are traveling and are managing multiple demands on their time and work, and the kind of ethically anchored social research that they do. We're just profoundly grateful, and from everybody here at Identities, from RaySed, from Casey in Lancaster, we'd just like to thank you.